There we go. Do. There we go. Do.
All right. Let's test y'all's microphone.
Testing.
How's that?
Is that looking good?
Yep.
Perfect.
Testing.
All right. Excellent.
We ready to go?
Yes, we are.
All right. Today we have Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore. We're so excited. I don't even know where to begin. Earlier today, we had Dr. Tom Ord talking about God in process theology. We just had Bob Mesley talk about process relational philosophy. And here you are rounding us out with process relational theology. So you're going to do the whole thing. So we're really, really excited. Just in terms of logistics and everything, scheduling wise, you've got a whole thing that you're going to do, and then we'll be able to ask different questions about that. So it's kind of like a seminar style. And then, for those who are live streaming in, feel free to ask any questions you've got on the chat. Trip will be monitoring that. And so, and then for those of you who are here, you've already mostly been here, but you kind of know how it works, where if you've got a question at some point, we'll probably do it more towards the end, but you've got the microphone, and we'll pass that around. So without further ado, Mary Elizabeth Moore, let's hear it.
Mason's introduction was the most lively part of this afternoon. Thank you very much, Mason. I'd like to start by asking you a question. You've been together, or many of you have been together all day, and I would like to know what questions are bubbling for you. I've prepared something, but I don't want to be oblivious to the kind of questions and insights that are bubbling for you. So if you could take a minute to breathe deeply and think about this question I'm asking, and maybe 2 or 3 of you could ask your questions so that others can hear.
You can pass that down. On the those attending live said we haven't got to explicitly Christian doctrines for those that have been very excited about the philosophical picture and the possibility of a God that doesn't suck. So I guess they can tell us what specifically Christian doctrines. Someone else said, could Mary Elizabeth Moore help me use the word sin without wanting to throw up? Are process theologians allergic to the eschaton? What does dipolar mean for the world and dipolar mean for God? Those are the internet.
Do you mind repeating most of that, beginning about the time you said throw up?
Oh, wait. So how would we talk about the doctrine of sin in a way that makes you want to hurl? Are process thinkers allergic to the eschaton? Tom had hinted about God's power and eschatological assurance. How would you deal with that? And then someone has asked a number of times about what does dipolar mean for both the world, and then how does that connect to the dipolarity within God?
Okay, thank you.
I think the aspect of the process God that I struggle with most is how to think about God's experience and the degree to which it's legitimate to think about God as a personal being, having the enormity of eternal experience as a conscious reality. Does it make any sense to even think about or ask a question like that?
Thank you. Anyone else? This is a huge plateful of questions, and all of you have heard the other presenters, and unfortunately I have not. But so if I repeat things that they've said, you please bear with me, but also if I contradict something someone else said, that's food for discussion. So let's dive right in. I prepared this as an introduction to process theology, and for that reason, I'm going to say some things at least that have already been said. I'm quite sure, but every time someone says something a little differently, you get a different angle. So let's dive right in. So what is process relational theology? I use that term, process relational, because someone identified process theology as process many years ago, decades ago, and it stuck. But it could just as easily have been named relational. And I think that the intimate connection between process and relationships is key to process relational theology. So I use that whole term. And I begin with quoting two of the people who've been most influential in the United States on this movement. They're not the only two, for sure, but they're two very prominent thinkers. And one is Charles Hartshorne, who describes he's describing process relational theology, which he calls by other names, a magnificent intellectual content implicit in religious faith and expressed in these words: God is love. Which words I sincerely believe are contradicted as truly as they are embodied in the best known of older theologies. In other words, everything boils down to those three words: God is love. And even the best of the older theologies has fallen short of addressing that fully. At this point, he is seeking to express it more fully. You can be the judge of whether he does that, but that is the center. And other process theologians have built on that theme. Many books have been written about love. And Alfred North Whitehead also writes about love, but his view of God is one that embraces a kind of aesthetic. And he describes God as the poet of the world, with tender patience, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. The poet of the world, with tender patience, leading it with God's vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. So we here have some reference to the experience of God and to God's hopes for the world. And that is continued by others. One of the books that has been particularly influential is Daniel Day Williams' book, The Spirit and Forms of Love, which, by the way, is a very interesting book to read. It's a much older book now, but it is one that is written in a very accessible and inspiring way. So process relational theology has characteristics that I'm going to identify. And the first one is that it is thoroughly relational, through and through. So that everything in the universe, everything in the cosmos is in relationship with everything else. And that is both the things that we can see and the things that we can't see. So the tectonic plates of the planet are connected. The plants are connected. The electromagnetic fields are connected, as are the continents. I don't know how many of you are actually looking at the pictures, but that means that when earthquakes happen in one part of the world, people are affected in other parts of the world. So an earthquake in one part of the world can set off a tsunami thousands, tens of thousands of miles away. And the earthquakes also in one village affect people across a broad range of villages. And we can only think about the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and the kind of devastating effect that they had on all the people of Turkey and Syria, all the people of the world. The last count I saw was more than 30,000 had were identified as having died, and the count was still going. That kind of a devastation creates human, political, economic, ecological reverberations across the world. So this interconnection, I'm not sure how many of you are seeing the pictures. Shall I assume how many of you are not seeing the pictures? That would be the most helpful thing. Okay, so I'm going to use words a little bit more than I would have otherwise. But when people are being festive and they're having festivals, they're dancing, they're playing, that affects the community and the larger society. When they are dealing with tragedies, whether it's a tragedy of an earthquake or a hurricane or some other kind of political insurrection, that affects everyone in the world. And what happens on one continent, what happens in one country affects every other continent and every other country. Now, these are things that we hear and they sink in at some level, but it is very hard to imagine the depth of that relationship. And so, some of the pictures that I show are pictures of compassion, where one or two or 100 people have entered into a tragic situation and have offered compassion to others. And that compassion is also relational. So the compassion of one affects the compassion of others. Also, the tragedies of one, the hurts, the depression, the anger, the violence affects. So violence, for example, has become a major feature of our 21st century world. And that feature is spreading, so that as it emerges and rises to power in one country, that influences others, sometimes through direct communication, sharing secrets about how to do insurrection or how to do violence, but it also just spreads in terms of attitudes and attitudes of hatred, attitudes of how to solve problems. You go straight to blaming someone else, and so forth. So process relational theology is thoroughly relational. It is also thoroughly processive, meaning that everything in the universe is in process. And that includes God. And we'll come back to that later. God is in every moment, luring the world toward goodness and beauty. And also feeling the world, feeling the beauty that's in the world, and feeling the pain in the world. I wrote a poem recently about how hard it must be for God to experience all of the pain that is taking place in the world. The pain of forests that are razed and destroyed, the pain of families who live in poverty and have no access to a ladder to get into some kind of a better situation. God feels every bit of that. And God lures the creation, not just the people, but the trees, the bees, the ants, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, lures them into a better future, a common good for all. So God is always guiding the flow of life toward what it can become. And there are endless possibilities for what the creation can become. There are endless possibilities that include tragic, violent, destructive ends, and that include truth, beauty, and goodness. I'm sorry you're missing the pictures. But the beauty of the universe. Okay, you don't have to see these pictures. I invite you to close your eyes and for just a moment and imagine a beautiful sight that you have seen recently? In that beauty, in the overall picture, and in every detail is God.
I bet we were all thinking of Tripp's face, right?
Say it again.
I bet we were all thinking of Tripp's face.
Oh, we were. How smart you are, Mason. Yes. See every detail of every whisker.
Always make sure you flatter the podcast host.
This includes little tiny plants. It literally includes ants. Did you know that ants have a communication system where they communicate with one another when they sense a change in the atmosphere? And they communicate it to the trees in the forest. So the ants are not just connected to one another, they are connected to the forest. And that's part of the beauty of this universe in which we live. A little tiny story. When I was in college, I took a course in botany my first year, and I just loved it. And I loved it in part because I had a fabulous teacher who took us on long walks into beautiful places, and he would get so excited about everything he saw. It just so happens that on a Sunday, I happened to be in church where he was in church. And when we walked out of church, he went out the door just right after I did, and it had rained while we had been in church. And he said, "Oh, look at those mushrooms." Because while we had been in church, mushrooms had sprouted out. Now, these were tiny little mushrooms. But here's a man who had eyes to see. And process relational theology is one that helps us develop eyes to see and ears to hear and fingers to touch. This also means if God is present in all and is present in the beauty and the pain, it means that genuine freedom exists in all of creation because God does not control it. And I know that Tom Ward talked about this morning, so I won't say a lot about it, except that Tom's book, God Can't, is just one example that in the very title helps you to be aware that God can't make everything all right all the time. But God is still there and present, moving, not only in the midst, but in the efforts of the ants and the honeybees and the trees themselves and the people to make the world more harmonious, more beautiful. It also means that, so we have genuine freedom, we people, we trees, to change. And that means that we have freedom to make war, which we do very well. We've perfected that freedom. Freedom to make peace. Freedom to imprison ourselves and imprison others. The resistance to doing anything about the mass incarceration system in this country is shocking. Why in the world would we not want to help people develop their lives in ways that are beautiful and satisfying for them as well as for the larger society? So we have the freedom to do that. We even know ways to do that, but we have the freedom not to. And a lot of the human impulse has been running in the not to direction. But we also have freedom to set people free. And that includes freedom over time. The pictures include King Kamehameha I in Hawaii, who was the first king to unify the Hawaiian Islands and the Hawaiian people. And he protected the freedoms for a very long time from foreign invasion. The freedom proclaimed by Frederick Douglass, who, having been reared a slave, not only found a way to educate himself, but to educate many others in spite of the punishments he received as a result, and became one of the most vocal and influential freedom proclaimers of the last 200 years. The freedom of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, how many of you actually saw the movie Harriet? It's a good movie. Go see it. But Harriet Tubman worked against all odds, first to free herself, and once she had accomplished that, to keep going back to her place and freeing members of her family and community, a few at a time. And she eventually cleaned out that community and they all found freedom. That is the kind of persistence that people have the ability to choose. The choice to set others free. And Abraham Lincoln would be another political example. And if you've done much study of Abraham Lincoln, you know that some of his actions were more freeing than others. He was a human being working within political systems, and so he was free to act, but he felt some limits on his freedom. And we can go back now and praise or critique, but we have to recognize that he exercised his freedoms, but he also chose places not to exercise his freedoms due to the limits placed on him within his context. We also have the freedom to destroy life, and that freedom comes out of smoke in factories. It has to do with decisions not to regulate pollution, decisions not to regulate carbon, in spite of the huge amount of evidence, and decisions about how to do policing, not whether to do policing, but how to do it, how much militarization is appropriate and how much is actually contributing to more violence. These are all decisions that we are free to make, and others are free to make, and we are free to discuss our different perspectives in order to make a collective free decision. Because no one perspective is going to be the answer to what needs to be done. And we have freedom to restore life. We have freedom to tend to the water supply of a village, or to tend to a foster child, or our own birth children. We have freedom to tend to elderly people or not. We have freedom to set goals for what we might do in terms of social freedom. Rosa Parks is a really good example because she freely chose to sit on that bus in the white section the day that she was arrested. But that wasn't her first act. She had been training for years in nonviolent resistance, and she had made free choices to prepare herself for whatever moment might come forth when she felt called to act. And others of you have done that in all kinds of different ways. People prepare themselves to be parents. They prepare themselves to care for others and so forth. They compare themselves to tend to rivers and to animals across the world. And let me give an example. The beluga whale in Alaska is threatened. Its lives are threatened, and partly because the beluga whale is highly dependent on a food supply and a communication system. The food supply is fish, which in the straits around Alaska, where fish have been scared away or overfished, the food supply is dying out. And those are actually the best places for the beluga whale to live. And then when you look at the communication system, they have very sophisticated language and communication, but it takes place underwater. And alongside a big city, they can't hear one another. So their communication system is obliterated or dimmed to the point that they're threatened further. So because of food supply and communication to a large extent, the beluga whale is far more threatened now than it was even 5 years ago. However, there are scientists studying these belugas, and they have discovered that there are ways to track the belugas and to discern what is interrupting their lives and to protect them. So they have citizens who live in cities near these water places who go out and stand on the shore and count the belugas. Because if they go out in boats, they're going to make too much noise. So they stand on the shore and count the belugas. That is a very promising decision that has been made in order to protect them. And you realize that that decision involves research, concern, action by scientists, but actions by ordinary citizens like us, who just give up a Friday afternoon or a Saturday morning once a month to go do their counting. And that kind of care is the kind of decision we are all free to make. And God is part of those freedoms and is part of our making those decisions and our being guided in them. So this means that God is everywhere. It also means that the entire cosmos is stirring with life. Even the rocks, even the things that we call inanimate objects, have some degree of life in them. Now, they don't have as much life in them as a human being or a gorilla or a bear, but they have life in them, which means they matter to God and they matter to the rest of the universe. So one of the ways to enjoy this life is to sit in a park and watch the birds, or watch the children, or play with the children, or take your dog for a walk, and you are in touch with that life. Now, another way to do it is just to go sit in a place and watch ocean rolling in, sea plants, granite mountains, rocky seashores, and just breathe in the life that's there. And that life is coming from everywhere. The rocks are breathing life. The seaweed is breathing life, as are the fish and the clams and the crabs and everything else. And the life of one species is important to the life of other species. And as much as scientists have discovered about this interrelationship of life, there's still a lot they don't know. So this is a constant uphill climb to learn more and more about how different species of plants, animals, minerals contribute to one another. In fact, you notice I even use the word minerals as a kind of species, because the more we can change our language to embrace the livingness of all creatures, the more we're able to recognize and appreciate, but also to interdepend. So let's dive deeper now into process relational theology, and I'm going to do a kind of intro piece, and then I'm going to pause and we can have some discussion, and then I'm going to move into some discussion of Jesus the Christ. But let me first look at some big concepts in process relational thought. First is the creativity of God in the universe. The universe is the universe is imbued with creativity in every aspect. So just as I said, everything in the universe has life. I also will say that everything is creative, and that includes the rocks, and it includes the solar systems and so forth. Even in Renaissance art, you see God portrayed in some of the frescoes and paintings of the Renaissance. You see God portrayed as a person, as a human being, but also as a moving, breathing, interacting being. And so in the universe, you have this presence, in the art, you have this presence of God who is present and is interacting and simply moving from one set of pictures to another is quite fascinating, because in some paintings and frescoes, you see God as kind of distant or as engaged with sin, casting Adam and Eve out of the garden and that kind of thing. In others, you see God as tending. You see God as moving above in and above the chaos in creation, and you see God as interacting with Adam and Eve in a very personal kind of compassionate way, and so forth. So creativity is built into the universe, and it's expressed in God as in everything else. And that creativity leaves us free to imagine what God is like, and to imagine God in many different ways, and to imagine human beings in many different ways. Before we get back to the question Tripp asked earlier, from the internet, this means that we can tell a story of creation that emphasizes the sin of Adam and Eve, or the sin of the snake, which the snake passed to Eve, which Eve passed to Adam, and therefore all the blame goes back to the snake. But the snake's not around, so we're going to put it all on Adam, on Eve, and that's why women can't be ordained. Seriously, this is a tradition of the Western Christian Church, blaming it on Eve. So you find the creativity expressed in focus on sin and the casting of Adam and Eve out of the garden, but you also find it in other tales of creation. In some Jewish midrashim, you have stories about Adam and Eve having been given the gift of moving into the larger world and procreating, being creative, doing creative things with their bodies, their arms and legs. And so our own creativity allows us to see creativity in a lot of different ways and to put the accent in different places. I'm thumbing through the pictures. Now I'm going to move to a more technical piece, and stop me if one of the other presenters has already done this, because I don't need to repeat it. I'm going to talk about actual occasions for a minute. Okay.
Love it.
Okay. So the creativity is grounded in the way the universe is designed. And this is one of the genius aspects of process relational theology. We are people. We can look around and see one another. We can even if you're close enough, you can see the color of someone's eyes. You can hear the tone of their voice. You can see question marks or boredom or excitement. You see those things. But actually, the universe, the planet, the universe, the cosmos are composed of micro occasions, which Whitehead calls events are occasions. And that means that at any moment, I'll just hold up my hand here, millions of occasions are taking place in my one hand. Because this is at a micro level, which means that movement, process that we've been talking about, is micro as well as macro. It's very easy to think in human terms and think of bodies. But actually, this process is the ground of everything that is. That's the reason you can talk about rocks as having some degree of life, because within rocks, there are millions of occasions emerging constantly. Now, these occasions are formed by three major factors. The first factor is the past. So let's go back to the rock, which I seem to be obsessed with right now. I'm going to leave rocks in just a minute. But okay, the rock was around millions of years ago. And maybe it was spewed up by a volcano. And maybe it was washed into the sea by the melting of the ice at the end of the Ice Age. And it's changed over time in those kinds of ways. And maybe it's sitting kind of still along the shore right now in New Hampshire or Maine, where there are a lot of rocks that sit by the shore. All of those changes that have taken place in that big rock have been going on for millions of years, but they're still going on. And they're going on not just in big movements like the closing of an ice age, but also in the micro events that are taking place. So, three factors I mentioned. One is the past. So I've just described something of the big past of a rock. And that big past influences that rock. It's still influencing it, but in a much more quiet, subtle way. Until you have a flash flood, which washes all the sand away and pushes the rocks in other places. But the past is a huge determiner. Now, for human beings, that means that we are conditioned. We've developed habits of the way things are done, the way we do things. And those are our past. They may be our personal past, but they may also be the community's past or our nation's past. Our nation, it has traditionally looked for enemies. It's also traditionally made partnerships. And I won't elaborate on that. But the point is that those are habits. That's part of our past. And it's flowing into this very moment, whether it's a little micro moment or the larger moment that's made up of a million micros. Are you following me? I don't think I'm going to use that. The second thing that's coming in here is God's initial aim. Because God is present in every emerging occasion. And this is why these little macro occasions are so important to be aware of, because it's easy to anthropomorphize and imagine the human-looking God being present, holding your hand, being your friend. But God is present in all these micro events as well. So you have this inheritance from the past. You have God's presence, which is expressed in a divine aim or an initial aim, so that at any moment, a country may decide to analyze all this past and then and then have a sense that maybe this is a time to make a new decision. And that sense may be coming from God's divine aim. You can talk about this without using words like sense, but I think it's easier to understand with those kinds of words. At the same time, you have novelty entering in. All of us have pasts the human race has past that are filled with a lot of different things. So novelty can pop up anywhere. My family was a very loving family, wonderful family. They cared for their community. I'm not naming them as perfect, but we had alcohol in our family, and that was a problem. Okay, so our family has a complex past. And that means that anything from this complex past might enter into a particular moment of time and a particular decision. And that brings novelty from the past. But novelty also comes from God's initial aim. Maybe God's aim for us in a particular moment or for one of these tiny occasions, maybe God's aim is something nobody's ever thought of before. That's never been done before, because God is God. So this initial aim is something fresh. And maybe the novelty comes from just bringing all of this stuff together. But what happens is when the past and God's initial aim and novelty come together, this tiny occasion that I've been talking about makes a decision. This is what I'm going to be. This is what I'm going to do. I'm anthropomorphizing this. I'm humanizing this to make it clearer. But we also, as human beings who are made up of multiple occasions and occasions of occasions, complex societies of occasions, we also make these decisions. So, for example, I'll stick with the alcohol that I started with. I have a cousin whose father was alcoholic, and two of our uncles were alcoholic. And she had decided that she was afraid that she might bend toward alcoholism, but she did enjoy a drink. So she paced herself. One drink a night, except on Fridays, and on Fridays, no drink. And she and her husband did that together. Now, the reason that was kind of an arbitrary decision that they worked out, but the point is she was disciplining and testing herself, because if she had discerned that it was impossible for her to get through a Friday night without alcohol, she would need to make another decision. Are you following me? So when people make decisions about what to do or what not to do based on this energy of the past, novelty, and God's initial aim. And the same thing is happening at the micro level. And the same thing is happening at the societal level. So you have moments in history in which countries at war suddenly reach a point where they decide, we're sick of this. We are going to make peace. Think of Northern Ireland, which is not 100% peaceful at this time, but which has made massive changes over time. Conflict after conflict. And then changes, some of which have seemed sudden. But this builds up over time. And so even on a societal level, these kind of changes are possible. Another thing about that I'll say before I move on is that one can call this process of actual occasions or emerging events incarnation. Because this is the way God enters in to the world continually, always, and is always present, even in the micro, which means that God is influencing, not just as a distant spokesperson, but God is entering in to each moment. And I think that I will detour here to respond to one of the questions that came up earlier. This is what I'll come back to it later. Never mind. I'll just stay on this for a little bit. but it does. I will say this much: it's why God's presence is always there, but why God does not determine outcomes. So God is entering every occasion, but each occasion makes its own decision about what it's going to be.
Mm.
And once that decision's made, it's done. It's part of the past that the next occasion will inherit. So if I make a bad decision, it's too late to change that decision, but it's not too late to change the next decision. The same is true at the micro level. Okay, what does this mean for the universe? It means that God and creativity are incarnate in all, and everything has dignity. Everything has dignity. That means that those beluga whales are dignified creatures of God, to be treasured. It means that every culture, every community has dignity. Even a gang culture in which violence is fostered and supported, and movement away from violence is hard to do. Those communities have dignity because God not only created the people and the community, but God also is present with them all the time. And the best way to make war, to destroy justice, is to disrespect the dignity of another, or another culture, another being. And that relates to all beings. So I've been explaining it first in sort of broad terms and then in more technical terms. But let me end this section, by saying that that a lot of things are beyond our sensations. So for Alfred North Whitehead, experience is at the center. Theology, metaphysics, all of these emerge out of experience. And they include our senses. But there are also senses beyond our senses. And one of the places where Whitehead expresses this is a much quoted statement. Yet mothers can ponder many things in their hearts which their lips cannot express. So in this universe that can be analyzed technologically and can be described as interconnected and with all kind of fancy words, at last there are some things in the universe that can only be sensed and beyond our senses. And they can only be expressed beyond our forms of expression. This is why artists and poets and musicians, I feel compelled to practice their arts, because very often they don't have words. They can't explain, but they can create, they can dance, and so forth. Now, all of this leads to an understanding of God as panentheistic. Did Tom talk about that today?
Yeah, I think you should go into it a little bit more, because I think fleshing that out a little bit more would be super helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Panentheism is not unique to process relational thought. You find it in other forms of thought. You find it in some indigenous traditions. You find it many places. So theism, in the traditional sense, what many people call traditional theism, understands God and the world as separate but communicating. This is oversimplified. Pantheism understands God and the world as one, so they're the same. Panentheism sees God and the world as internally related, and related in such a way that each transcends the other. So there's more to God than the world. And there's more to the world than God. So, which means that we are perfectly able as human beings, as ants, to ignore the divine aim. We don't, it's not normally a conscious decision. But to just do what we've always done and be quite content with it. And there are aspects of us that God is present, but God is not one with. You understand the difference? So God is present when one human being kills another, but God is not one with that action. So the world is transcending God. And at the same time, God transcends the world. And which means that there's more to God than the world, which means God brings something distinctive to the world. Now, one of the best images of this that I've ever heard came from a student who was not a student of process thought, but we had many process discussions, and she was trying to discern how God and people related. So she asked her, every year she would go to India and study with a guru. And sorry, it wasn't India. It was a particular place in China. She would stay in a monastery, and her spiritual mentor was a monk. Sorry about that. So she would spend a month in the monastery, and she would walk with her spiritual mentor, pray, meditate, and so on. And one time she said to the mentor, "How do I know what is God and what is me?" That seems pretty hard to figure out. And the mentor said, "Let's take a walk." So they took a walk up a mountain, and they just sat at the top of the mountain for a long time. He invited her just to look and see what she saw. And she said, "I don't quite understand what you mean, what you're hoping I will see." And he said, "Do you notice the two rivers below us? One's coming from this direction, one's coming from the other direction, and they join into one river. Okay, look at that one river and tell me which part of that river came from the left and which part came from the right." And that's how she came to understand her relationship with God. It was integral, intimate, and she couldn't expect ever to fully sort out what tugged at her as God and what tugged at her from other sensibilities. That's panentheism. We live in that kind of world where everything comes together, and it's not easy. In fact, it's impossible to sort out what might be coming from God or what might be God and what might not be. When you're holding a small child, you're holding God. When you're feeding a puppy, you're feeding God. When you seek clothing for people who have none, or work on expanding housing for people who live on the streets, you are touching God. You're not going to know how much of your action is God and how much of it is maybe wanting to show off how good you are. But much of it is God. You can trust that from a process relational frame because God is in everything. And impulses to goodness are impulses from God. But that doesn't mean you always know when the impulse is toward the good. And I'll give one other example of panentheism before I close off this part, and that is that I don't know how many of you have been to the Alps more than once, but I've been to the Alps about 4 times over my life, and I've hiked on the glaciers. And one of the things that struck me is that over a span of maybe 20 years, 15 to 20, those glaciers have gotten much thinner. And some of the glacier melt is so extreme that the glacier is now half of the size it was when I first saw it. So what is God? And what is the result of processes of climate change, some of which are human caused, some of which are caused by other factors? That's panentheism. God is present in those glaciers, and God is present in those rocky mountains that are left when the glacier melts and moves away. God is also present in the thirst of people who are losing their water supplies and animals who are losing their habitats and so forth. But God is not causing the glaciers to melt. Some of the melting is by natural processes out of creation, and some of it is human-caused climate change. Okay, I was going to move now to a focus on Jesus, and I want to pause, though, and take some time for us to discuss before I do that. And Mason, you and Tripp might want to say something about that connects what people have heard earlier today to what I've said.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think at least following the conversation in the chat, the way you gave so many examples lining up kind of helped deepen and expand the way Bob was helping us think. The whole cosmos, you're an experience of nature, not an exception, right? So if you start to attend to your own experience, then you can start to see the way the experience of other entities exists, and then the way you kind of built out all these different parts of our experience and how that both helps us understand other creatures, but also understands God's experience of the world. And so there are a couple questions around that. How does this kind of reflection of a process perspective of our being in the world help us understand the way God is present, involved, experiencing the world? We distracted Bob enough; he never turned the corner towards the reciprocity of God and world in Whitehead's vision.
Good.
I had a similar question along those lines of you sometimes hear from the Christian circles around the fact that God's love is not like our love. And again, if we kind of go along this line of God being the chief exemplification of what's happening in the world, then maybe the idea that God's love is not like our love means that God's love is an exception to our love, that like God loves completely different than us. But maybe it means actually that God's love is not our love, meaning that God is actually more loving than we could possibly imagine. Again, kind of this along these lines of like what the chief exemplification means for the world, and what that means for God.
Thank you. This last question, I think I'll start with because that actually is a little bit easier to answer. I think that for Whitehead and for Hartshorne, it's more the second. That God's love is like our love, and our love is like God's love. But God's love is bigger, and God's love is more dependable, more trustworthy, but bigger to encompass the whole. whereas our love is normally limited. But is always limited. But that doesn't mean that our love is not God's love. I loved my husband. I still love my husband. He died 7 years ago. I love my husband. And that love was God's love. And loving him was loving like God, or being a vessel for God's love. Was it pure? Oh, no. So I don't make any claims to that. But for me to think it's a wholly separate thing from God's love would be to deny that God's love permeates me and can permeate any of us and all of us more and more as we open ourselves to it.
Mm.
You want to push back on that?
No, it's beautiful.
I don't feel like pushing back. I like it. But one of the when you think about the nature of divine love and even the purity joke, I think we often notice it in other people before we notice it in ourselves. Like we can tell just those stories about motivations of other people so that we never ultimately give them the kind of affirmation for goodness that their action happens. But when we imagine the way in which, especially in a process vision, God experiences, internalizes, receives the world's experience moment to moment, how does the fullness of God's companionship change the nature of love and the nature of the initial aim or the possibilities or the lure? Like when we think about the person we love, and it's obviously Valentine's Day and thinking about it, sometimes it takes years of therapy for me to realize that what I thought was being loving and caring to my partner 20 years ago was really me trying to invite her to perform the toxic elements of my family system I had not yet recognized. Right? Like we learn these things over time and then discover the impurity that was still doing something, right? When we look back, we go, but it's still beautiful, right? Like there was more confidence in the text message between a session and her sending me pictures of the kids with the gifts I had delivered, and like that was there 20 years ago. But part of that is coming to grips with all that's getting itself done in us that we're unaware of. And one of the things I've struggled with trying to imagine is what love looks like when that kind of self-deception isn't there, when the full presence of each past becoming is part of the divine life. Like that to me is the challenge of idolatry or projection within a process relational framework about love, is that we keep giving to God the kind of impurity and unconscious activity that we discover in ourselves. And anyway, what do you think about that? I've been thinking about it, and then y'all discussing it made me go, huh.
So what you said was big. I'm going to tease out one strand to begin with. Would you say that your love for your partner, your wife, and your love over time enabled you to discover some of the sickness in the love in earlier years?
Oh, yes. Both the fact that it was there gave you the taste of the potential, in a sense, right, to keep pursuing it. But I also think an encounter of the greater depth one encounters in any kind of relationship then makes you go, oh, you haven't figured out the full depth dimension yet. Let's do this. It's like why, who was I can't remember the philosopher now, but in Derrida's exploration of friendship, right? Like one of the things he says is that a 20-year-old never uses the word friend like an 80-year-old. And it's not because they aren't referring to friends. It's just duration of relations gives a new depth. And like I think of that and then go, Now, what about the actual occasion, which is, God?
So you've just, I think, answered your question. I mean, you were asking it to the universe, but underneath what you've just said is a huge insight that love is a process and a relationship, and that over time, you and your wife have shared love in such a way that the process has led to more largeness, more self-awareness, more critique and transformation. Is that fair to say? And that also has to do with acts of charity, acts of justice. And so to understand love is to understand it as a process and a relationship that never ends. And it's the very process that allows it to continue to grow. Now, I should add that these processes of concrescence and the processes I've been describing of change over time can lead to creative transformation. They can also lead to disaster. So just because a process is taking place and just because everybody is in a relationship doesn't mean that everything's going to come out all right. Relationships can be very destructive, and processes can go awry, can lead to terrible tragedy. But when you're engaged in the spirit and form of love, to quote Williams, then you're engaged in a process and a relationship that has potential for becoming deeper and deeper over time, and more meaningful and more just. Is that fair enough to describe what you've been talking about?
Well, at least I hope so. Unless this is another element of my self-deception.
Now, let me come back to the other question that came up electronically, and that is the dipolar nature of God.
I was literally about to ask.
Oh, really?
Yeah, perfect.
So, in Whitehead's understanding, God is whole, unified, but dipolar, meaning that one pole is called the consequent nature of God, and the other pole is called the primordial nature of God. Now, those words already tell you a lot about what they mean. The consequent nature of God is God interacting with the world, the divine aim, the presence that we've been talking about. That is the consequent nature of God. It is aspect of God that contributes to our becoming and becoming and becoming, and that receives our pain, our joy, our experiences. And by our, I mean everything. And receives the experiences that may be beyond the experiences of God's creation. Experiences that we can't imagine, experiences of God. That's the consequent nature. And it is consequentially helping to shape the world. And it is being shaped by the world. So when I say God feels the pain of creation, I don't mean, oh, God goes off and mourns for a couple of days and comes back and is all well. I mean that the pain of the world changes God, because God also is in process. So the experience of the world influences God. And that means, and then in turn, God influences the world. So it's this relationship that is in process, and it is thoroughly relational. That's the consequent nature of God. It's a nature to which we pray. It's a nature that we often experience if we have a high holy moment, a significant religious experience, or a moment of wonder looking at the clouds. The other nature of God is called primordial, and you can imagine primordial, great big. And that is not the nature of experiencing, it is the nature of possibility. God is attuned to all the possibilities that exist within our universe, and those possibilities, God inform how God interacts with the world. So the possibilities are abstractions, but they are abstractions that God contributes into the world. The possibility might be peace in the midst of destruction, or healing. Or I'm giving more popular names to these. We don't have names for them, but they're possibilities. And because God interacts continually with the world, and also has access to all the possibilities that are, then God's interaction with us is promising to guide, if we can be guided, and promising to receive the realities of the present moment, and to just and to, this part is less clear in Whitehead, but it's there, and to draw from the possibilities that are most needed and possible at a particular moment in time. So that is the way that Whitehead conceives of the dipolar nature. Hartshorne has a different way of doing it, but this dipolar nature is a way in which Whitehead explains perpetual change and the possibility of creative transformation, at the same time recognizing that God transcends the world. Panentheistically, God transcends the world and therefore can offer into the world truth, beauty, and goodness that we can't offer on our own. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that?
Like the way I think through that difference between the consequent nature of God and the primordial nature, and maybe this analogy is totally wrong, so correct me where it needs to be corrected, but it would be similar to, like, the consequent nature of God would be similar to the fact that you would love your husband because you were married to him differently than you love me because you met me an hour and a half ago. So the way that you love each one of us is going to be different because of your relationship with that person, because of who they are. Whereas like the primordial nature is that you're going to love regardless, because that is part of who you are, is love. What would you say that that's like a good analogy to explain the difference between the primordial nature and the consequent nature? Or I'm curious, like, what maybe analogy you would use to kind of explain those differences.
That's challenging. I mean, that's a very good question. The primordial nature, these possibilities are eternal. They, but they're not definable. We can't list them. We can understand some of the values that come out of them. The value of love, for example. They're eternal, whereas the world is changing constantly.
Like God loving the world when right after the Big Bang, right? Like in the singularity that the world, and how simple the world was at that moment. God is going to love the world in a different way, I think, than the way that God loves the world now, with this expanding universe and living things now in the universe. Yeah. Would you say, because of the fact that what has happened in the world over all those billions of years, that consequent nature of God is going to be changed because of what has happened in the world, and so therefore God is going to love the world differently in each of those moments? But the fact that God is loving has not changed, because that's eternal to God.
Yes.
Okay.
That was a good explanation. You run into because Whitehead develops it metaphysically. You run into limitations of ordinary language.
Mm.
But yes, to what you said, that was a good way to say it.
There's a question in the chat would be that I think would help kind of respond to this. Mary Elizabeth mentioned the nature of God incarnating potentially in every moment. As someone who's recovering from a rather literalist form of Christianity and not sure if I'm on speaking terms with God yet, anytime I hear the word incarnation or inspiration and things like that, I go, watch out. So the question I would love to hear is how, if we don't think of Jesus as a magic intervention, or how, if we don't think the Bible, probably the King James, is the holy, inerrant, eternal word of God, do we use in a process vision a way of understanding the uniqueness of the incarnation or the particular nature of the inspiration of Scripture?
That's a great question. It's more than one question.
Well, I mean,
So
you can pick whichever part you want. That's one of the tricks, of live streaming, is you just pick what you want to answer.
I'm going to begin with the incarnation question, because you notice that when I talked about incarnation, I wasn't talking about Jesus. I was talking about the incarnation of God in the world through this process of concrescence at a micro and a larger level. And that's disruptive to the idea that God is incarnate only in Jesus.
Mm.
It's saying that God is incarnate in the entire cosmos. It's also saying another subject that this person's not asking is whether God could be as fully incarnate in another human being as God was in Jesus. And from a process perspective, the answer by most process theologians would be yes. And one might look at the Buddha or other figures in the history of humankind and identify some people that you think might not want to be labeled that way because they're coming out of a very different cultural and religious frame, but who exemplify the kind of fullness of God's presence, our divine presence, our goodness that Jesus did. Now, the other part about the Bible is also a good question. And the Bible, the creeds, are all expressions of tradition with a small t. The tradition with a big T is inexpressible. It's the gifts of God passed through the centuries, the eons. And it's a gift that's not graspable. It's not explainable. Our traditions with a small t are great in helping us to grasp some of the bigness, but they can't help us grasp the whole. And so anytime we fall into Bibleolatry or creedology, I'm making up a word that's not going to work, but being convinced that our creeds are the beginning and end of all truth, we forget about the big tradition that is God relating with the world. And we lose our humility by thinking that we know it now because we have access to these traditions. And I don't want to belittle the traditions, nor do I want to belittle any particular interpretation of the traditions. But because they're traditions with a small t, then they are open for us to discuss, analyze, question, debate. I think one of the best examples of this is in Judaism. In Judaism, people in general, people are not, this is a general statement, but it's true of much of Judaism. People aren't trying to get to the right interpretation of a biblical text. They are trying to dive deeply into a biblical text in discourse with others. in order to make new discoveries every time they go back to that biblical text. So you may have any biblical text, and there will be dozens, maybe even hundreds of rabbinic sayings about that text, interpretations, but they're studied alongside the text as interpretations. You may have many midrashim, stories that draw out different aspects of the text, or imagine things that weren't named in the text. That is all to keep the text open, to keep them alive, and recognize that interpretation is an ongoing process of discovery. And 90% of the fun is making new discoveries every time you go to that text, or every time you study with someone else, or hear someone else speak to it. So I do think that in process thought, that kind of openness and distinction between tradition with a small and large T is really important.
Okay, so in a sense, when we become a biblicist or creedalist, we're committing a form of misplaced concreteness, because we're doing it with a tradition and the little t, like you're doing. And when we do that, we end up forgetting God, who is the tradition with a capital T, and that's in process, right? So, okay, that's very helpful, and I'm totally going to steal that and probably forget you told it to me, and then be like, so you know the difference between a big T and a little t. But here's something I've been thinking about. When you recognize the religious traditioning, in a sense, of the divine in all these communities of wisdom, it actually gives a framework for helping understand how the consequent nature of God shows up in unique, in particular ways in different traditions. So, like when Christians talk about the incarnation of Jesus, he didn't happen in a vacuum, right? He was inheriting a tradition where the people of Israel have wrestled with the one who called Abraham and Sarah out, right? Yeah. And you think of those stories in whatever way they happened in history, in whatever way they became memories that are told, in whatever way they became rituals that are passed down, all the way to, right, like Jesus's mama singing revolutionary bits of Isaiah while he's in the belly, right? So, I wonder if there's a sense that then the faithfulness of Jesus, the way you were describing earlier, his responsiveness to the initial aim, shaped by his receptivity to the God-world relationship throughout his history, that he actually had a potential that was different than what came before, because he's able to not just incarnate by his saying yes to the lure, the abstractness of good, true, beautiful, adventure, and zest, if we get to add those. But also, he is making material the experience of God tangled up in those covenantal relationships. And just like our own loving relationships have a different kind of depth over time, the wisdom traditions, and for Jesus, right, like the prophetic tradition of Israel, gave him a possibility of depth that isn't there before the ongoing narratives and traditions and histories, generation to generation. That there's the horizon of his fidelity in responding to God has a particularity to it, precisely because of that inheritance. Is that? What do you think about that? I don't.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But I would add that I don't think we know why Jesus was fully receptive.
Yeah.
But I would share with you the view that Jesus was fully receptive of God's aim and fully human. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't half and half or somehow mixed together in a casserole, but it was fully, because what it means to be fully human is to be fully in relationship and in process with God. So he was fully, and somewhere I won't go there. It's too complicated, but I will say that I think the way you said it is very helpful.
Well, thanks.
And actually, it makes me want to go to the.
We got like 10 minutes.
10?
Yes.
Okay, let me just choose something.
Okay.
I want to deal with Jesus the Christ because this is looking at Christian process theology, and I want to look for a moment at Jesus the Christ, who is understood often in dichotomies. Jesus was either divine or human, and so forth. And I want to just name 3 dichotomies that I think process relational thinking pushes beyond. I'm going to do this in a skimming way because we're almost out of time. But the first dichotomy is between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Now, if you've ever studied theology, you've been introduced to those terms. However, why is that a dichotomy? Why is the Jesus of history a contradiction to the Christ of faith and vice versa? The Jesus of history places the accent on Jesus' life, ministry, and teachings, whereas the Christ of faith puts the accent on Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. Are those not connected? And do they not give meaning to one another? So that's one dichotomy that process theology pushes against. And I'm not going to elaborate, just mention the dichotomies. If you look at art of Jesus in different parts of the world, you'll discover that in Africa and many parts of Asia, that Jesus is portrayed in a very human way, and often in a way that's human and also kind of ethereal, but very human. And this dichotomization doesn't happen in all parts of the world as much as it happens in North America and parts of Europe. The other dichotomy I'm going to mention, I'm only going to name one other one. The other dichotomy I'm going to mention is relates to Jesus' work, soteriology. And I'm not going to develop this in detail either, but I want to recognize that throughout history, the church has not forced a decision on what understanding of the work of Christ or the work of Jesus is best. It's had at least 4 different understandings that have just ridden alongside each other for hundreds of years. And some of those place the emphasis on God's work. God sent Jesus into the world to recapture humanity for God. That's sometimes called the fishhook theory. I'm being very general here. Please recognize that. Another one is that God sent God's Son into the world to satisfy the honor that the world had not given God. So to make up for, to reshape the honoring of God. Another one is that God, and this one's very popular in many circles, God sent Jesus into the world to receive the punishment that we all deserve in our place. We're saved by the blood of the Lamb, for example. So Jesus received the punishment so that we could be saved. And another theory is the theory that Jesus' life is the most important thing, and therefore God sent Jesus into the world to exemplify the fullness of a godly life, or the fullness of life as it should be, and therefore to influence us to live that way. Now, that's an oversimplification, but here's the part I want to emphasize. David Ray Griffin wrote a book on Christology and soteriology many years ago now. And he looks at these various theories, and he says, there are 2 things that these theories have in common, or 2 things they debate. One is, did Jesus' entrance into the world objectively change the world by suffering for our sins, for example, or in some other way? Or did Jesus into the world subjectively change the world by representing what life could be? And Griffin makes a point from a process perspective that why choose between those? God sent Jesus into the world, or at least the witness we have reveals that it did have an objective effect on the world. It objectively changed the way the world was and could be. Doesn't mean the world is totally transformed in good ways. It doesn't mean Christians have all the answers and that Jesus is the only answer. It means that objectively, Jesus' life, death, resurrection, ministry, the whole bit, objectively changed the way the world is. And at the same time, it subjectively changed the world because it led us to see an image of what God is calling us to be, to follow Jesus. And if any of you who were at John Cobb's birthday party last night, he ended up saying, and he said this many times, that his sole purpose in life is to follow Jesus. That's the bottom line for him. And that represents the subjective work of Jesus. Now, that to me is one more way that process theology breaks through the dualisms and invites us to consider the wholeness of Jesus' work in the world. I wanted to get that in just because it connects with a lot of things that came across in the questions. And now I'm going to shut up, but I think these people deserve to be able to say something.
Yeah. Well, if the microphone's right there, we have like 3 or 4 minutes. So if someone has a question, and then if there are more questions, they can do it after we stop the live stream and I roll up chords. So, but we want to make sure everyone has time to go eat dinner and things to be here for those that are local to be back for the memorial service. So, anyone have a plus? We have the perseverance of the saints for 3 intense process sessions in one day. That's probably the main way process people do the Trinity, right? 3 long discussions about Whitehead. Going once, going twice.
Sorry that we didn't leave much time for your questions. We got the ones on the internet.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and wrap up. Remember, everyone that is in here, you'll get you can go watch and relive whatever you want on the internet later. And those of you online, we will make the videos and audio available. I'll email you at some point while I'm hanging out in Claremont with the links and such. But I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all for being here in the room. Thank you for all of you online. And Mary Elizabeth, thank you so much for helping us wrap up. It's been a blast, and I look forward to seeing everyone again in person or through a series of streaming zeros and ones.